Great. So if we're all here and we're all ready, then I suppose it's time we get started. Hi, everyone. I would like to welcome everyone to the American Society for Yad Vashem's book club discussion. My name's Nicole Garay, and I'm very pleased to be co-chairing today's event from the Western region. I'm in San Francisco. Before we get started, I did want to take a moment to acknowledge our brothers and sisters in Israel who are once again experiencing hatred and war. Let's please take a moment to pray for the safety of our families, friends, colleagues, soldiers, and the entire nation of Israel. Again, after acknowledging that, I just want to appreciate everyone who has taken the time to come here today. We know what's going on is deeply affecting everyone, and that being said, it makes it so much more important that we continue to tell the stories of the survivors. I know for me personally, what's going on in Israel is deeply sensitive because as some of you know, both of my grandparents, my grandma and my grandfather, were Holocaust survivors. After the war, they went back to their small village in Hungary, and it still was not a safe place for them to just simply exist and be Jewish. So Israel was that refuge and that safe place. It was the place where they were able to raise my dad as a young boy who got to enjoy being a young boy and doing young boy things, not having to fear about their neighbors and what happened just a few years prior. So that being said, it is super fitting that we are all here today to tell the story of a survivor of the Shoah. Remembering the victims and the survivors is important and personal for me and for a lot of people here. I first became involved with the American Society for Yad Vashem a few years ago, participating in the virtual 6K run in honor of my beloved grandmother and grandfather, who were both born in Novi Zamki, Slovakia in 1921, and survived the horrors of Auschwitz to build a beautiful life and family in San Francisco, CA. In 2021, my grandma was honored in Tibron on her 100th birthday. She was honored for surviving the Holocaust and also for surviving COVID twice. She gave us quite a scare when she landed herself in the ICU, but we wouldn't expect anything less from her. She survived. She came out smiling, but unfortunately, she did pass away almost exactly a year ago at the age of 101. And I do think about her every day. And my way of honoring her and my grandpa is being here today. So I'm so glad I can participate. The Young Leadership Associates are carrying on the mission of Holocaust awareness and have undertaken the critical task of developing ongoing programs to connect our generation to Yad Vashem's mission. We are dedicated to preserving our Shoah legacy by educating others about this critical period in Jewish history and carrying it forward as future leaders. We began the YLA Book Club in 2018 as a way to connect deeply to the Shoah and understand the unique aspects of survivor stories. We have these discussions to never forget and to keep the lessons, stories, and memories alive. Because of its enormous impact, YLA made the decision to host the discussion, but open it to the entire ASYV community. A couple of points I'd like to take note of. I do want to remind you that this program will be recorded. However, most of the event will be spotlighted on myself and our speaker. The other point is that if you have questions throughout the presentation, please share them in the chat box, and we will get to as many as we can later in the program. And now, the most exciting part, a little bit about tonight's author. Usually, we do a very full introduction of our speaker. This evening, I want to share that I feel a strong kinship with Suzette Sheft. Like me, Suzette grew up with a beloved grandmother who survived the horrors of the Holocaust. I think you will first be touched by Suzette's accomplishment at such a young age. I will leave it to Suzette to explain the reason behind her writing Running for Shelter and the journey for doing so. I will tell you some details about Suzette and then let her share the rest with you. Suzette is currently a senior at the Horace Mann School in New York City. She lives in Manhattan with her mother, twin brother, and 2 dogs. In her free time, she enjoys writing, reading, running, and teaching. She began writing Running for Shelter when she was only 13 years old and hopes her novel encourages other children to record important stories from their own family legacies. We are going to give Suzette the microphone to share with you both her reasons for writing her novel, as well as a little bit about her grandmother's story. If you haven't already done so, we hope it will inspire you to read the book and share it with a young person in your life. You will find the link to order the book in the chat. Miriam's going to post it. And please do remember to add any questions you have in the chat box so we can pass them along to Suzette. We will have the opportunity to do so after the presentation. And once again, we're so thrilled to welcome you to the Young Leadership Associates Book Club and are eager to hear your story. Thank you for sharing your story with us tonight, Suzette. Take it away.
Hi, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Nicole. Before I start, I also just want to recognize how, in light of the horrific attacks against Israel, telling these stories of the Holocaust and sharing the stories of survivors is even more important, because this is the reason why we need a state of Israel for the Jewish people. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself. So I started writing Running for Shelter when I was 13 years old, as Nicole previously mentioned. And I started writing Running for Shelter because when I was that same age, my dad unfortunately passed away from pancreatic cancer. And I found in the months following his death that I couldn't really remember the stories that he used to tell me every night before bed. And although I had written maybe a couple down, I hadn't taken the time to record every single one. And I really regretted that because I felt like I had lost all of the pieces of my dad and his childhood that he had shared with me. And because of this, I didn't want to lose any more family stories. And I've also always had an interest in the Holocaust. I think it probably started from having a grandmother who was a hidden child during the war, but I also think it was just because as a Jewish person, I was surrounded by Holocaust survivors as well. And so growing up, I exclusively read books about the Holocaust, whether they were historical fiction or memoirs. I've since expanded my horizons a little bit. I read a more diverse group of genres and books now, but I still tend to prefer books related to the Holocaust. And so combined with my desire to preserve the stories of my grandmother and my interest in the Holocaust, I decided to interview my grandmother, and I spent time at her house for a couple of weeks, and she told me the stories of her childhood, starting with her life in Vienna, then her escape, and finally her immigration to America. And while she was doing that, I wrote down everything that she said, and I later turned that into a book, a historical fiction book that is called Running for Shelter. And the process behind Running for Shelter was complex, but I absolutely loved every minute of it because I'm also very interested in creative writing. And so it started, as I said, when I was 13. So after I finished interviewing my grandmother, I started turning some of my notes into different chapters and drafts. And I found that I thought I had a finished draft a couple of weeks after I interviewed my grandmother, but I definitely did not. And I went back and I added more details, and I watched an interview of my grandmother that was conducted by the USC Shoah Foundation for supplemental information because it had been conducted 10 years before. So just to find additional information. And then I spent lots of time editing it, hours researching and rewriting. And then I finally found a publisher, Amsterdam Publishers, who I'm so thankful agreed to work with me and publish my book because I'm a teenager and a new author. So I wasn't expecting that.
I just want to ask you a question about that really quick, Suzette. I mean, I think I can speak for all of us here that it's pretty amazing to see that you were able to publish this book that you started writing at 13 years old. When you were 13, what were you thinking? Were you Were you nervous to find a publisher? What was it like? Were publishers kind of like intimidating?
So I found my publisher. I don't remember exactly how old I was. I think I was between ages 14 and 15. So I wasn't 13, but it was a little bit intimidating, but I had read different books on like the publishing process, like how-to books, I guess, and done research. But I think just the thought of working with a publisher was a little bit intimidating, but I knew that if I wanted my grandmother's story to be shared with the world, that was the route that I needed to pursue and take a chance on, even if it might have been a little bit scary or very difficult.
And were you intimidated to actually finish the book itself? Like, were there moments when you're like sitting there and you're like, holy cow, I'm 13 years old, I'm 14 years old, I'm 15 years old, and I'm writing a book about such a heavy topic?
I think that when I wrote the book, I sort of distanced myself from believing that it was true. I was sort of like in the weeds of writing the book, that I sort of viewed the characters as fictional characters. I think it also helped that my grandmother now goes by a different name than the name that she goes by throughout most of the book. And so I don't think that it sort of like resonated with me how complex and how deeply this had affected my grandmother. But looking back on it, I definitely cannot imagine how I did that. And
Well, I'll let you finish sharing the details about yourself, but I think I could speak for everyone. We're all very impressed of you.
thank you. That's so nice. So after I found my publisher, my book was published in November 2022, almost 1 year. And yeah, so now before we go to our Q&A section, I just want to share a little bit of my grandmother's story, give you an overview for people who haven't had a chance to read it yet, and then also share a couple of pictures of my grandmother during her childhood. So my grandmother was born in Vienna, and she lived with her mother her grandmother for until she was 9. And when she was 9, the Gestapo police came to her door and they were looking for her father, who was divorced from her mother, but who had come to stay with her family because he was worried that he was going to be taken. And the Gestapo came and they took my grandmother's father away. And after that incident, my grandmother's mother, Stella, decided that it was not safe for them in Vienna anymore. And she took my grandmother, so whose name was Inge at the time, and they escaped to Lausanne, Switzerland. And then then Stella abandoned my grandmother and went to Paris because she got a working visa. She was working for an opera singer. And my grandmother lived in Lausanne with a host family when she was only 9 years old. And the host family was not very welcoming to her. So at 9 years old, she went out and she bought her own food and she took care of herself. And then eventually, around like a week later, a smuggler came and he took her over the border to France. And then she took a train to Paris, where she thought she was going to be reunited with her mother, but she actually ended up having to stay with an uncle whom she'd never met before. And they stayed in a tiny one bedroom motel room. And this is very different from what my grandmother had grown up with. And she was obviously very homesick for her mother, even though we'll get into it later, but they had a very complicated relationship. And then my grandmother found out that her mother had gotten a working visa to go to America, and she was going to leave my grandmother at 9 years old alone in Europe during the war. And that is when the whole story sort of changes, and my grandmother ends up going to another host family because her uncle joins the French resistance, and then the host family sends her to a boarding school to keep her safe from the bombings. And then eventually her grandmother comes and essentially rescues her and takes her to a very small village in central France, where they stayed for the remainder of the war. And my grandmother worked on farms and went to school. She actually graduate school only at age 12 on the village. She then ended up going to college in America and finishing her education and became a teacher, but that's a different story for later. And worked and supported her grandmother until years later, they joined her mother in America, in Manhattan. And so that's my grandmother's story. And also, it's important, there's something I want to share. And my grandmother's story is very unique, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to share it with the world, because no Holocaust story is the same, and I have especially never read a story similar to my grandmother's, and so I thought it was important for children to learn and read about stories that are different from even though every Holocaust story is different. I think it's important to read just various stories. And so my grandmother actually did not know she was Jewish until after the war. And she, in order to stay safe, she actually began to practice Christianity, but religion had never really played a big role in her childhood. So now I'm going to share a couple of slides of my grandmother. Okay, so this is my grandmother's visa. This is one of the images that was not in the book. I regret not putting it in the book. It's my favorite image of all time. And this is the visa that she used when she came to America. And so you can see her name. Her last name was Isinger, and Inga Monique, which is the name she started to go by. And that's her. And then we have a picture of her with her mother as a child and her with her father. And then this is my grandmother's host brother. So she lived with this host brother in Paris after her uncle joined the French resistance, and they became very, very, very close. And she thought of him as a little brother, and she was very sad when she had to leave him to go to the village with her grandmother. But this is an image of my grandmother at the boarding school. And she had very short hair because they had to shave the children's head because there was a lice infestation. And then this is my grandmother in the village in central France. And this is her with other kids. And then this is my grandmother. We're not sure exactly when this was taken, but around the time when the visa picture was taken. This is my grandmother. And then, and this is her grandmother, whom she also called Omi, just like I call my grandmother. And then, my screen is glitching, sorry, I have to stop and reshare. But that was essentially the end of my slideshow. There's just a picture of the cover of the book, which you can see here. I can also read a passage from the book, or we can go into a Q&A section.
Why don't you go ahead and read a passage if you want to? I think, you just gave kind of like a quick version of your grandma's story, but the way that you actually wrote it in the book, like you said, it is like historical fiction, but I don't even really consider that because it just felt so real and authentic to me, and I really enjoyed the way you wrote it. I think like I had a little bit of apprehension when I went into the book. I was like, okay, this is written by somebody who's like a lot younger, I don't know what it's going to be like. I wasn't the best writer when I was 13 years old. And I was so pleasantly surprised and think you just did a magnificent job. So I'm sure everyone would love to hear you read it.
So this is a little bit of a spoiler for people who haven't read the book, but I'm going to read the last 2 pages of the book. Those are, that's one of my favorite scenes. So for context, my grandmother and her grandmother received visas to come to America, and they took a ship called the Ile-de-France to Manhattan. And one thing that my grandmother had always dreamed about was seeing the Statue of Liberty, because to her that was the epitome of being an American and of freedom. And you'll see her reaction in this section. Okay. I think that is Manhattan Island, exclaimed a man, pointing to the tall, dark shadows rising from the fringes of their vision, and his children began to cheer and jump up and down. Monique had to consciously remind herself of her age to stop from joining them. We're almost there, she whispered into Anna's ear, giving her a tight hug, and she saw her grandmother smile for the first time in many months. When the color of the water had completely lost its clarity, turning into a brown, muddied color, Monique knew that they had entered the Hudson River. She squinted into the horizon and searched the eastern landscape for a glimpse of America's Lady Liberty, their symbol of freedom. The statue's blurry greenish hue began to materialize, and shortly, Monique could make out the points of her crown and the folds of her robe. Stretching her chin up as high as she could to catch the sight of the torch, a beacon to the lost and wandering, Monique felt lightheaded. She had waited for nearly a decade to be rescued from the nightmares of the war. Overcoming displacement, violence, and extreme loneliness, she was finally being guided into safety. The Ile de France blew its horn, announcing their arrival into New York just as it slipped into the shadow of Lady Liberty. The statue dwarfed the ship, eclipsing the passengers with her magnitude and grace, comforting them with a sense of protection. Ignoring the screams of delight from the children around her, Monique turned to focus on Anna's face. Her grandmother had been her protector and guardian for all of those long years in peril. She wrapped her arms around Anna. Omi, she breathed, her voice heavy with emotion. Omi, we made it. Anna's eyes sparkled, a glimmer of hope illuminating in them. She leaned onto Monique and used the breath she had been saving to speak to her. My darling, you are so brave. I am honestly in awe of your courage. You do not need to continue running for shelter anymore. Your life without shelter begins today. Anna paused. I protected you from some very important information about our family so that you would be safe, but it's time for you to know the truth. Monique held her breath as Anna spoke. Monique, you are Jewish. And that's how the book ends. Thank you.
Thank you for reading that for us, Suzette. We're so grateful for you being here, and not just for you sharing your grandmother's story, but also telling us about the reason for doing so. I know that many of us can relate to you and your journey. So now for everyone, Suzette and I will go through some question and answers, and please continue to put questions in the chat box if they come up. So first, how do you suggest young people get started on writing stories of their own family legacies?
I think asking questions is always the first way to start. You can start by asking your parents to tell you a little bit about their childhood and maybe ask for them to share some stories from their childhood. And then if your grandparents are still alive, or if you know your grandparents, you can go to them and ask them to tell you about their history. And once you've built sort of like a foundational base and made sure that the person sharing the story is comfortable, because especially, at least with my grandmother, it took me a while to get her to sort of feel comfortable sharing her story, because it was a very hard time and is very difficult for her to remember. But once you've created sort of that safe place, you can start to interview your family members and record their stories. And of course, now with the internet and with technology, it's very easy. You can use Google Docs or the Notes app and record everything. Or you can also videotape the interviews, which my grandmother's interview was videotaped by the USC Show Foundation earlier. But I also wish I had taped my interview with her, because I would have loved to actually look back on it rather than just look back on the notes. But
yeah, that's amazing. And I have to ask, how was your grandmother's English?
Oh, her English is perfect. She
Yeah.
speaks, yeah, her
Yeah,
English
my
is perfect.
grandma's English wasn't so perfect, so getting the
Really?
stories out of her were always a little bit challenging. One part because she was so sensitive about it, but two, she was definitely looking for a few words. But that's one of the many things I love and fondly remember about her was me trying to teach my grandma English when I was younger, playing teacher and whatnot. But anyways, we'll go to the next question. What do you think changed in Monique's own thinking about her life when she changed her name from Inge to Monique? Is there a symbolism on taking that new name of her own choice?
So there were a couple of different reasons why she decided to change her name to Monique, but one of the main reasons was that in her new chapter, living in the village in central France, she sort of did not feel that she completely fit in. The students or her classmates would make fun of her name Inga because they pronounced it like Ange, and the French word for monkey is singe, and so they would call her, like they would say she was a monkey, she looked like a monkey with her red hair and freckles, and so she felt very isolated. And at the time, Monique was one of the most popular French girls names, and so in order to fit into her new society and her new group, she decided to change her name to Monique. And I think she's kept that name because as long as I've been alive and as long as my dad was when my dad was born, she went by Monique. And so I think maybe it might symbolize her new take on life and her new chapter, leaving behind her past in Vienna and her complicated relationship with her parents to start fresh as Monique from this small village.
Yeah, I mean, that was the part that I really enjoyed in the book, and I'll just read it for everyone really quick. She is asking her grandmother to have this new name, and she says, her grandma responds and says, I guess it won't hurt for you to have a fresh start, not to mention that you truly deserve something special, as I know how hard you've been working to provide for us since our arrival here. Well, I suppose your new name is Monique. And that was just like such a special moment for me in the book, especially because right before that, the grandma had said to her, well, I guess this must be really important for you because you've never asked me for anything. And I thought that was just a testament to your grandma's character, and how hardworking she was, and how at such a young age she still was providing for those around her and not asking for things in return. So I was really, really impressed and enjoyed that chapter a lot.
I still see those characteristics in her today.
That's wonderful. So the next question, what were her feelings when she discovered she was Jewish? Did she embrace that identity right away, or did it take time? Did she feel comfortable with her Judaism in adulthood?
I think her feelings surrounding Judaism were complicated for as long as she had grown up, or at least starting. So when she grew up, she did not know she was Jewish, and she did not think she was Christian either, but they did celebrate Christmas. But once she escaped with her grandmother in order to stay safe and fit in, she started going to the church and actually had a communion. And I think that because she had been practicing that religion for so many years when she was in hiding, it sort of felt like it sort of felt right to her. And so I think that she embraced that rather than her Judaism. And although she's very interested in the Holocaust, and she also too, just like me, we exchange book recommendations. She reads a bunch of memoirs and historical fiction books about the Holocaust, and she's very passionate and interested in Jewish events and Jewish life, but she practices Christianity, and she's sort of felt a more connection, at least from my interpretation, to that, and she went to church her whole life. Yeah.
That's a great answer. And before we jump into the next question we have, I did notice a question from the audience asking, why did she have to leave Vienna if she did not live as a Jew and did not even know she was a Jew?
Thank you. That's a really good question. So, although my grandmother, who was 9 years old, did not know that she was Jewish, her mother, who was Jewish, knew, of course, that they were Jewish, and she wanted to find a way to protect herself and her daughter because it was not safe for Jewish people in Vienna. So even though they did not live like Jewish people, everyone would know they were Jewish because it was on their birth certificates, it was on their legal documents, and so they needed to find a way to escape. and that's why they left Vienna. So it wasn't my grandmother's choice, it was her mother's choice, but I'm very glad that her mother did choose to.
Yeah, and just while we're on the topic of Vienna, I'll skip ahead to one of the other questions we have, and ask it now. Did she ever go back to Vienna?
Yes, my grandmother has gone back to Vienna, and she's visited the site of where her old apartment building used to be. And although it's no longer up, there's a picture in the book. I can look for it. I can show you of this cathedral that she saw that was directly outside of her window. It's called St. Stephen's Cathedral, and she used that as a marker and was able to see where her apartment building used to be and see that building that she would look out of her window every single day for the first 9 years of her life. And so this is the building. I don't know if you can see.
That's really cool. That's awesome that she went back there. So next question. You definitely ended the book leaving this question or wanting to know more. Will there be a second book? Can you tell us a little more about how her life went after she landed in New York?
So I get that question a lot, and I am not sure regarding the second book. I would love to maybe write a sequel to the book, but I'm also interested in learning other Holocaust survivor stories and also learning about different genocides. So we'll see where that takes me, but I would love to, of course, write a sequel maybe. I think that would be a lot of fun. And so I can give you sort of a summary of what maybe the sequel would look like, what her life was like after she came to America. So once she came to Manhattan, she and her grandmother lived with her mother and her new stepfather in a small apartment building. And my grandmother went to high school, and she finished high school, and she went on to go to NYU after not having any knowledge in English and learning it all while she was in high school. And she then became a teacher, and she taught French to middle schoolers for many, many, many years. And she had 2 children, my dad and my aunt, and now she has 4 grandchildren.
That's wonderful. I was wondering, not to give any spoilers, if it was going to come full circle, because in the book there's that chapter where she mentions she wants to be like the social worker who helped
Right.
her.
Yeah.
Yeah. But teacher, I feel like is kind of similar.
She's told me she did want to be a social worker, but the schooling didn't exactly line up. I think there was something going on. It was either she had to go to extra, it was just something that didn't
Didn't
work.
work out. Yeah.
Yeah, but she was very happy that she became a teacher because she was still able to work with kids and sort of still help
Yeah.
in different ways.
That's wonderful. We're definitely getting some more questions. Let me see. Okay. Well, I'll just take some of the audience questions now, because this is an easy one for you. Did your nuclear family practice Judaism, and does your family identify as Jewish? I guess we
So,
could ask if you identify as Jewish.
so my immediate family, so myself, my brother, my mom, and my dad as well. We all are Jewish. I had a bat mitzvah when I was 13, and my Devar Torah was actually about the importance of stories and my grandmother's stories. So maybe that was almost foreshadowing what I would do later that summer.
Wonderful.
Yes. And yes, I practice Judaism. My immediate family is Jewish. I'm proud Jew.
That's great. So we have another question that I think is from Adele, and I think Adele would.
Wait, I'll expand on that a little bit more.
Okay.
So although my grandmother did not practice Judaism and my dad wasn't directly raised as Jewish, his dad was Jewish. And so his grandparents, his dad practiced Judaism, and his grandparents on that side also practiced Judaism. And my dad became very connected to Judaism later in life, and he went to Israel, and he had a bat mitzvah there around like when he was in his 20s, and he just became very involved in the Jewish community and was throughout his whole entire life. And so, yes, Judaism is a big part of my immediate family.
That's really wonderful. And I'm glad your dad got to have those experiences. So
And
Adele,
my and my mom's parents are also all Jewish, and I don't know if you know, but if you know this author, but I.L. Peretz, who was a Yiddish author, is actually my distant relative, and he was an amazing writer as well. So yeah.
that's awesome. Well, sounds like you have a great family. Uh, and I'm 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 glad that your dad was able to explore his Judaism. I'm sure that was like a really interesting journey for him as someone whose mom survived, not knowing she was Jewish, et cetera, et cetera. So Adele asked, she said her mother was also born in Vienna and she was a ballerina in the ballet corps of the Vienna Opera House. She also escaped to Switzerland. She wants to know, how old was your grandmother when she came to the United States, and did she learn English here?
Wow, that's amazing that she was a ballerina ballet corps. It's really cool. I would love to learn more about that. But about my grandmother was around 18 years old when she came to America, and she did learn English here. She learned it during school. I have two stories about that if you want to hear. They're very short. So when she was in school, there was an assembly, and she was good friends with another girl who had also survived the Holocaust. And she turned to the girl and she said, "Do you understand what's going on? Can you translate it to me? I don't understand what's going on." And the girl said, "Well, when you join a new school, you need to learn English for yourself." But it turns out that the girl also did not understand what was going on either, and they both then learned English later. But another story is that my grandmother spent all night learning English while she went to high school during the day. And so sometimes she was so overworked and so overtired that she would fall asleep in French class, and she was not doing well on her French exams. But of course, she was fluent in French. The reason why she wasn't doing well was because all of the words, all of the sentences were English sentences that you had to translate into French. And when she told the teacher her story, the teacher said, "Go back to sleep, it's okay," because she knew that she was fluent in French and that she was learning English at night. So that was
Aw, that's a good story. Yeah, I like that one. I like that teacher. And Miriam asked, was the Holocaust a big topic of conversation during your childhood? Did your grandmother speak about it often?
So my grandmother she would tell me occasional stories about her childhood if I asked, but she didn't like to talk about it all the time. After I interviewed her, she actually told me that she had nightmares the following night about it. So I think talking about it was very difficult for her psychologically. But my dad would tell me a lot about it as well, and he was the first one to actually share her stories with me during when he would tell me the different stories at night. So it came through my dad and then eventually through my grandmother after my dad passed away.
Right. Yeah, that is a hard topic to talk about. Um, all right. Let's see. In regards to Monique's family dynamic, did she have relationships with her mother and father as an adult?
So her relationship with her mother and father was a little bit complicated, I'm sure, as those who have read the book can assume. When she arrived in America, she did live with her mother and her stepfather, but her relationship was never the same with her mother. There was sort of a distance between them, and I think my grandmother sort of viewed her own grandmother as more of a maternal figure than she viewed her mother. And but they did stay. They of course stayed in touch and stayed in contact because they are family, and my grandmother knew my dad and my aunt, and she saw my great grandmother knew my dad and my aunt, and she saw my grandmother raise her family and her kids. It just did not have that same relationship. And my grandmother's relationship with her father, they were never close. My great grandmother, my great grandfather had gotten divorced when my grandmother was very young, so she didn't have that foundational relationship anyways before the war. So after the war, it sort of stayed the same. And he also lived in Austria while my grandmother was in America. So there's also the physical distance as well between them.
And did your grandmother ever learn about her father's story during the Holocaust? Because we basically, in the book, we have the scene where he gets taken away, and then fortunately, magically, he reappears. But there is a little gap in between.
Yes. So she did learn about her father's story when her father sends for her in the newspaper, puts the ad in for the newspaper, and they reunite. So her dad he actually worked as, from what my grandmother has told me, I'm not sure 100% if these are all the correct details because her dad told her so long ago, but her dad worked as a chef in one of the concentration camps, and that's how he survived. It might have not been a concentration camp, it might have been a work camp, but in one of the camps.
Well, thank you for answering that question. We have one more question from the audience. I would imagine that your grandmother married a Jewish man. Yes, she did. If she still went to church, was it not awkward for the family? Was it a successful marriage?
Yes, it was a very successful marriage. They were married for around 70, almost 70 years, if not more. And it was not awkward for the family because in modern days, I think there are a lot of families who practice two different religions, or whose parents are not the same religion, and it was sort of up to the children to choose what they wanted to do. My grandmother never took them to church, and my dad at least leaned more towards Judaism, and he would spend the Jewish holidays with his dad's parents because they were active members of the Jewish community.
And then the last question, and perhaps the most important question. The American Society for Yad Vashem does a program called Lessons from Our Parents. What are the lessons you have learned from your grandmother that helped you?
Wow. I learned many lessons from my grandmother, not only while I was growing up, but also from hearing her story. But I think one of the main lessons was how it's important to stay optimistic and to persevere even through the most difficult of times. My grandmother never stopped, never gave up hope. She kept working, she kept supporting her grandmother, and she always had a positive outlook, even throughout the war and the unknown. And so I really, really, really admire her perseverance and her strength. And that is something I will always take with me forever.
And I will say, I think one thing that's notable about like your grandma's story and my grandma's story and a lot of the stories I hear is the importance of family. And I think that even if, your grandma didn't have like family in the most traditional sense that were supporting her and that she was supporting, she still had such an incredible grandmother. I mean, for me, that story was so powerful when she's at the boarding school and there comes her grandma to save the day. And I think that's a wonderful thing that is really a lesson from our parents is how important family is, and how, at the end of the day, we have our family, we have our Jewish community, and it's a great thing to support those people and in turn have them support us.
Definitely. I definitely agree.
So, that being said, Suzette, is there anything you would like to leave us with other than what you already left us with?
Well, I wanted
Maybe suggest people to buy your book.
yes, if you liked listening to this conversation, please go read my grandmother's story. I would love, I love and appreciate your support. But I'm so grateful that you all chose to come in to listen to this talk. I really, really, really appreciate it. And I know my grandmother does too. And thank you so much. I think I just want to emphasize how important it is that we listen to these stories about the Holocaust and that we record these stories before it is too late, especially because now I'm a third generation. My grandmother was the Holocaust survivor. And so now my generation needs to start informing other generations about the younger generations about the Holocaust, because the Holocaust survivors, unfortunately, will not be around forever. So it's so important that we do this now.
Yeah, and I do want to add, while I'm telling people to buy your book and you're telling people to buy your book, you're calling it your grandmother's story, which is really lovely, but it's also your book. You put a lot of hard work into this and it's really wonderful. And I want to say, for everyone that's listening, I think this is a really great book for young adults and teenagers to read, because it kind of is, one, it's a different story than usual, but the other factor is that, it's not super violent or triggering, but it really shows the hardships and how these young people had to grow up. Your grandma had to grow up in such a short amount of time, and the fear that was going on in the world then and how horrible it was. But at the same time, it's appropriate for, young readers. So I think it's a really wonderful book. And for everyone listening, all I ask is that you support Suzette, you buy this book, maybe you buy it for a friend, you share it with somebody, because like Suzette said, we are the third generation. We're getting farther and farther removed from these survivors, which is why it's so important to tell their stories. Especially at a time right now where anti-Semitism is so high in the States after what a tragedy has happened in Israel. So that being said, the only way through this is together with our Jewish community, and supporting Suzette and buying this book and sharing it with someone is supporting all of us. But on that note, if you are interested in becoming more involved with American Society for Yad Vashem, which I hope you are, please reach out to Dana. We will put her email address in the chat now. And also, please continue to keep our Israeli brothers and sisters in your thoughts and prayers. We hope to see you again soon, and thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much to everyone.